The silence was a physical presence in Observation Chamber 7, a weighted blanket of sterilized air and filtered light. It pressed against Elian's eardrums, a low, subsonic hum that was the signature of the spire's circulatory system. He stood before the panoramic chromoglass, his reflection a pale, attenuated ghost against the storm-darkened cityscape beyond. Below, the sky lanes were empty, the automated transports docked and silent, their guidance lights extinguished. A Category Gamma cyclonic event, the Central Authority had announced. All sectors sealed. All personnel to shelter in designated safe zones. For Elian, that meant this chamber, a sterile white cube suspended 57 floors above the silent heart of the metropolis, his prison for the next 72 standard hours. He was not alone. The other ghost in the glass, sharper and darker, was Kyle. Kyle sat at the central console, his back a rigid line of discipline and the severe cut of his Analyst Prime uniform. The only sound in the room was the whisper-faint click of his fingers on the holographic interface, a cascade of crystalline data flowing through the air before him. He was not looking at the storm. He was not looking at anything but the numbers, the projections, the cold, hard facts of their suspended project. They were rivals, two opposing poles of the same magnet, forever pushing against each other in the silent, ruthless meritocracy of the spire. Kyle was precision. He was logic. He was an alpha of the highest designation. His biology a perfectly calibrated instrument of focus and command, as sterile and efficient as the city itself. Elian, by contrast, felt like a collection of poorly concealed flaws, a fragile construct of suppressants and sheer bone-deep willpower, an omega. The word itself tasted like ash in his mind, a biological vulnerability he had spent his entire life trying to scrub from his own code. Elian traced a line on the cold glass with one finger, the condensation leaving a fleeting smear. His own reflection stared back, eyes wide with attention he refused to let Kale see. The lockdown was an inconvenience, a frustrating delay in his work, nothing more. He repeated the mantra in his head, a litany of control. The tremor in his hand was a product of caffeine, not fear. The faint, cloying sweetness he could almost taste at the back of his throat was a phantom, a trick of the recycled air. His cycle was not due for another 4 weeks, 7 days, and 3 hours. He had checked the schedule that morning, as he did every morning. His biometrics were stable. His suppressant levels were optimal. Everything was under control. It had to be. In the spire, control was not just a virtue. It was survival. Unscheduled biological events were not merely personal failings. They were systemic disruptions, defects, and defects were corrected permanently. The atmospheric pressure has dropped another 4 kilopascals, Kyle said, his voice cutting through the silence without inflection. It was not a conversation. It was a data point offered into the void. The primary storm wall will make contact with the spire's kinetic barriers in approximately 17 minutes. Elian did not turn. He just watched Kale's reflection, the way the light from the console carved sharp angles into his face, making him look less like a man and more like a predator carved from obsidian. They had been competing for the position of project lead on the Ethelberg anomaly for 6 months. 6 months of sharing lab space, of dueling data streams, of a cold, professional animosity that vibrated in the air between them. Kyle's work was flawless, his logic unassailable. He was the system made manifest, the ideal alpha citizen. He never showed emotion. He never seemed to tire. He was a perfect, beautiful, terrifying machine. Elian hated him with a quiet, cellular intensity that felt dangerously close to obsession. He hated the way Kale's presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the room, leaving Elian feeling breathless and exposed. He hated the way Kale's scent, a clean, sharp fragrance like ozone and cold metal, was so faint it was barely there, a testament to his superior biological control. Elian's own scent was locked away, a ghost in his own veins. He had never known its true character. From the earliest age, Omegas in the spire were taught that their natural pheromones were a liability, a primitive signal that invited chaos. Their heats were not natural cycles, but medical conditions, to be suppressed, regulated, and scheduled with pharmacological precision. His life was a fortress built around that one central weakness, a fortress whose walls were beginning to feel unnervingly thin. He pressed his palm flat against the glass, feeling the deep, resonant vibration of the spire, as the first winds of the cyclonic event struck the outer shields. A low groan echoed through the structure, the sound of a sleeping giant stirring. The lights in the chamber flickered once, twice, then stabilized. But in that brief moment of uncertain darkness, a wave of heat, sudden and dizzying, washed through him. It started low in his belly, a coil of warmth that was entirely alien. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white where he pressed against the glass. A phantom, a stress response. He was letting the lockdown affect him. He was being weak. He forced himself to take a slow, measured breath, counting the seconds. In, 1, 2, 3, 4. Out, 1, 2, 3, 4. The protocol for anxiety mitigation. He was a man of science. He was a creature of logic. He was not an animal. The auxiliary power has engaged, Kale stated, his fingers never faltering on the console. All non-essential systems are now on standby. Life support and primary data servers remain at 100%. He did not notice the flicker of panic in Elian's eyes. He did not notice the fine sheen of sweat that had suddenly broken out on Elian's brow. To Kale, Elian was simply a variable, a competitor, a presence on the other side of the room, a problem to be solved, or preferably surpassed. But the heat did not recede. It lingered, a low ember smouldering deep inside him. And with it came the scent. Not ozone, not cold metal. Something else. Something sweet and terrifyingly familiar, like burnt sugar and wilted flowers. His own. It was faint, a bare whisper in the sterile air. But to Elian, it was a scream. He squeezed his eyes shut. It was impossible. His suppressants were state-of-the-art, a continuous microdrip administered by a subdermal implant that was monitored in real time by the Central Health Authority. It had never failed. It could not fail. The reflection in the glass seemed to mock him, its face pale and slick with a fear he could no longer deny. The fortress was breached. The animal was awake. And the only other living soul for 57 floors was the one person he could not afford to show any weakness to. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break within the pristine, silent walls of Chamber 7. The hum of the environmental controls shifted in pitch, a subtle recalibration as the chamber's atmosphere scrubbed itself, adjusting for the change in barometric pressure and the sudden, minute alteration in its chemical composition. Elian heard the change with an unnerving, preternatural clarity. Every sound was amplified, every sensation sharpened. The synthetic fabric of his uniform felt abrasive against his skin. The recycled air tasted thick and metallic on his tongue, and the low, ambient light of the chamber seemed to pulsate with a sickly yellow glow. He felt porous, as if the carefully constructed barriers between his internal world and the external one were dissolving. He turned from the window, his movement stiff, robotic. He needed to get to his workstation, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of data streams and algorithmic modeling. He needed to pretend that the strange, liquid fire pooling in his gut was a fiction. He took a step, and his knee buckled. He caught himself on the edge of a sterile white table, his breath catching in a sharp, ragged gasp. The movement sent another wave of heat through him, stronger this time, accompanied by a dizzying vertigo. The room tilted, the clean lines of the furniture blurring at the edges. From across the room, the soft clicking of the holographic interface stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was a listening silence. Elian did not need to look to know that Kale was watching him now. He could feel the weight of that gaze on the back of his neck, as tangible as a physical touch. It was a cold, analytical scrutiny, the way one might observe a failing component in a complex machine. "Are you compromised, analyst?" Kale's voice was flat, devoid of concern. It was a clinical inquiry, a threat assessment. Elian pushed himself upright, his hands trembling. He smoothed down his tunic with a jerky, unnatural motion. "I'm fine," he said, his own voice sounding distant and thin. The pressure changed, a momentary disorientation. It was a plausible lie. Plausible enough. He risked a glance at Kale. The Alpha was still seated, but his posture had changed. He was no longer focused on the console. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes narrowed. He looked like a wolf that had caught a scent on the wind, a scent it did not recognize, but knew, instinctively, was significant. A cold dread, colder than the sterile air, washed over Elian. He knew what Kale was smelling. He was smelling failure. He was smelling the sweet, traitorous perfume of Elian's own unraveling biology. He had to get away. He needed a sealed space, a med bay, a sonic cleanser, anything to mask this burgeoning disaster. But there was nowhere to go. The chamber was a single, seamless room, with the exception of a small, adjoining sanitation unit. The door was a smooth, featureless panel that would only open with a vocal command tied to their assigned biometric signatures. It was a space designed for two. He forced himself to walk, one measured step after another, towards his own console on the opposite side of the room. Each footfall felt heavy, disconnected from his own will. His body was becoming a stranger to him, a vessel for this rising tide of heat and sensation. He could feel his own scent glands beginning to ache, a dull throb in his wrists and at the nape of his neck. They were activating. After a lifetime of dormancy, they were waking up. He sank into his chair, the cool polymer a shock against his overheated skin. He called up his own interface, the familiar blue light of the data fields, a welcome anchor in the swirling chaos of his senses. He tried to focus on the fractal patterns of the Ethelberg data to find the cold, hard logic within them. But the numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless symbols. All he could think about was the heat, the spreading, insistent heat. And Kale. His awareness of the Alpha was a constant, humming frequency at the edge of his consciousness. He knew, without looking, every shift in Kale's weight, every subtle change in his breathing. It was an unwelcome, invasive intimacy, a side effect of the storm raging in his blood. "Your core temperature has elevated by 1.2 degrees, Kale stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. His console was linked to the chamber's environmental sensors, which included passive bio-monitors. Kale was reading his vital signs. He was watching him fall apart in real time. "My core temperature is within acceptable parameters," Ilian countered, his voice tight. He tried to inject a note of cold authority into it, the tone he used when they were debating statistical models. But a tremor ran through him, a violent shiver that made his teeth click together. The lie crumbled into dust. He was losing control. The carefully maintained facade was cracking, and the thing he had kept caged for so long was beginning to press against the bars. He could feel a slickness blooming on his skin, a sheen of sweat that carried the scent, making it stronger, more potent. It was a smell of desperation, of a deep biological plea he had never been allowed to voice, a scent of honey and rain and something deeply, achingly feral, a scent that was designed to do one thing and one thing only: call to an alpha. He hunched over his console, wrapping his arms around his midsection as if he could physically hold himself together. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a man, and he was breaking. And the only person there to witness his disintegration was the one man he wished would see him as anything but broken. The cold, perfect, untouchable alpha who was now rising slowly, silently, from his chair across the room. The air in Chamber 7 grew thick, heavy with an unspoken question. Kale moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was unnervingly predatory. He did not approach Elian directly, but began a slow, circling path around the central console, his eyes never leaving the Omega's trembling form. He was assessing, analyzing, his mind processing the anomalous data points, the elevated temperature, the erratic heart rate, the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in Elian's hands, and the scent. It was the most confounding variable. It was faint, yet it cut through the sterile ozonic purity of the chamber's air like a dissonant chord in a perfect symphony. It was a biological signal of a type Kale had only ever encountered in redacted case studies and historical data archives, an unscheduled, unsuppressed Omega heat. Impossible. Such events were relics of a primitive past, biological glitches that had been engineered out of the population for generations. To witness one now was like watching a fossil reanimate. Elian could feel Kale's approach as a shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. He kept his eyes fixed on the meaningless data on his screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his console. He could hear the soft, almost silent tread of Kale's boots on the polished floor. Each step was a hammer blow against his fractured composure. The heat inside him was no longer a coil. It was a liquid fire, spreading through his veins, pooling in his belly, making his limbs feel heavy and weak. His thoughts, usually so clear and ordered, were fragmenting into a kaleidoscope of panic and a strange, terrifying new sort of need. It was a deep, cellular craving for something, something he could not name, something his conscious mind recoiled from in horror. He needed to say something to re-establish the boundary of their professional rivalry. He needed to push Kyle away with a wall of cold, clinical language. But the words wouldn't form. His throat was tight, his tongue thick. All he could produce was a low, involuntary sound. Oh, soft keen of distress that he immediately tried to swallow back down. It was too late. The sound, small as it was, hung in the air between them, an undeniable admission of vulnerability. Kale stopped his circuit, He was standing directly behind Elian now, a tall, dark silhouette against the flickering console lights. Elian's breath hitched. He could feel the faint warmth radiating from Kale's body, could almost sense the calm, steady rhythm of his heart. It was a stark contrast to the frantic, panicked drumming in his own chest. Analyst Elian, Kale's voice was low, pitched just for him. It was still formal, still clinical, but there was a new quality to it, a razor's edge of something he couldn't identify. Curiosity? No, it was more intense than that. It was focus, a singular, unnerving focus. Your suppressant implant appears to be malfunctioning. You're experiencing a cascade failure of your endocrine system. You're in heat. He said the last words with a cold, detached precision, as if diagnosing a piece of faulty equipment. But the air around him was shimmering with a tension that was anything but detached. The faint, clean scent of ozone that always clung to Kale was changing, becoming sharper, charged with an electrical intensity. It was the scent of an alpha reacting to a stimulus, a powerful, instinctual response that Kale's own formidable control was struggling to contain. Elian flinched as if struck. Hearing the word spoken aloud, hearing it named by Kale, made it real. It was no longer a phantom, a fear. It was a fact, a catastrophic, career-ending, life-altering fact. A wave of shame so profound it was nauseating washed over him. He had failed. He was defective. He was everything the system had taught him to despise. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "It's a fever. The storm, atmospheric radiation." He was grasping at straws, offering up pathetic, flimsy excuses that he knew Kale's logic would shred in an instant. Another tremor racked his body, a violent, full-body shudder that forced a pained gasp from his lips. The scent glands in his wrists pulsed with a sharp, sweet ache, and the smell of his own need, his own desperation, bloomed into the air, thicker and more potent than before. It was the scent of honeyed almond and rain-soaked earth, a deeply organic, fertile perfume that was an act of profound rebellion in this sterile, synthetic world. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the disgust, the cold dismissal, the inevitable report that would be filed the moment the lockdown ended. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only silence, a deep, listening silence that was somehow more terrifying than any reprimand. When Kale finally spoke again, his voice was different. The clinical edge was gone, replaced by a rough, strained texture. "That scent," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the floor, through the base of Elian's chair, through his very bones. "It is inefficient." Inefficient. The word was absurd, a desperate grasp for clinical terminology in the face of overwhelming biology. Kyle was fighting it. He was fighting his own nature, trying to categorize and analyze a phenomenon that was designed to bypass analysis entirely. And in his struggle, Elian felt a flicker of something other than fear, a strange, wild, and terrifying sense of power. He was a glitch in Kale's perfect system. He was a chaos variable the alpha could not compute. The room had become a crucible, the air charged and volatile. Kyle stood frozen behind Elian's chair, a statue carved from discipline and warring instinct. The scent, Elian's scent, was a physical thing in the air now, a complex tapestry of chemical signals that bypassed his higher brain functions and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of his alpha biology. It was not like the synthetic pheromones used in compliance training, which were designed to be targeted and controlled. This was wild, unfiltered, a raw broadcast of need and fertility that his body was responding to on a cellular level. His own scent, usually suppressed to a barely there hint of ozone, was thickening, sharpening, a low growl of ozone and static electricity, answering the sweet, desperate call in the air. He was losing control. The thought was both terrifying and, on some deep, unacknowledged level, exhilarating. For his entire life, Kale had been the master of his own internal systems. He was Analyst Prime Kale, his genetic designation a tool, not an identity. He viewed his alpha nature as a strategic asset, a source of focus and drive that, when properly managed, gave him an edge. Now, that asset was turning on him. It was a mutiny in his own blood. Elian, huddled in his chair, finally dared to turn his head. He looked up at Kyle, his eyes wide, luminous with fever and fear. The sight was like a physical blow. Elian's face was flushed, his lips parted, his pupils dilated to black pools that swallowed the light. A fine sheen of sweat coated his skin, catching the cool blue light of the console and making him seem to glow from within. He was beautiful. The thought struck Kyle with the force of a revelation, a piece of data so anomalous it threatened to crash his entire operating system. He had never thought of Elian in those terms. Elian was a competitor, a rival, a series of data points and performance metrics. But now, stripped of his composure, radiating a vulnerability that was so profound, it was almost a form of strength. He was beautiful, and that terrified Kale more than the loss of his own control. "You need a medical kit," Kyle said, his voice a harsh rasp. He was forcing the words out, trying to reimpose order on the chaos. "Emergency heat suppressants. There should be a level 3 kit in the primary storage unit." It was a logical course of action, the correct protocol. But he didn't move. He couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, caught in the gravitational pull of Elian's distress. "It's too late," Elian breathed, a note of despairing finality in his voice. He knew the progression. He had studied the forbidden texts, the historical medical archives. Once a heat cascade began, especially after long-term suppression, it was a biological inevitability. Emergency suppressants might dull the edges, but they couldn't stop the tide. "It's too late." He looked away from Kale, a flush of shame coloring his neck. His hands went to the collar of his uniform, tugging at it as if he was suffocating. The fabric felt like sandpaper, the high, tight collar a choke hold. With a small, desperate sound, he fumbled with the magnetic clasp at his throat. It gave way, and the collar fell open, exposing the pale, graceful line of his neck and the frantic pulse beating at its base, right over the scent gland. The gesture, an innocent attempt to breathe, was a devastating act of provocation. The scent bloomed from that newly exposed skin, a concentrated wave of pheromones that hit Kyle like a drug. It was intoxicating, sweet, spicy, with an undercurrent of something that smelled like fear. His own instincts roared in response. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary, primitive sound he could not suppress. He saw Elian flinch, his eyes widening in terror at the sound. Kale took a half-step back, his hand clenching into a fist at his side, his knuckles white. "My apologies," he gritted out, the words tasting like metal and self-loathing. "Involuntary physiological response." He was talking like a machine again, trying to distance himself from the animal that was stirring inside him. He remembered his own training, the simulations. As a designated alpha of high potential, he had been subjected to rigorous conditioning, to ensure his biological imperatives would never compromise his operational efficiency. He had been exposed to concentrated pheromonal stimuli in controlled environments, trained to override, to compartmentalize, to remain in command. He had never failed a simulation, not once. But this was not a simulation. This was not a sterile, synthesized compound. This was alien. This was the scent of his rival's complete and utter undoing, and it was triggering a response in Kale that felt terrifyingly like possession, a deep guttural instinct to claim, to protect, to mark, to silence the distress signal with his own presence, to cover that sweet, maddening scent with his own. He looked at the pale, exposed skin of Elian's neck, at the frantic pulse beating there, and a singular, horrifying thought burned through his mind. Mine. The thought was not his own. It was an echo from a deeper, older part of himself, a part he had believed was dormant, vestigial, a ghost in his genetic code. The ghost was awake now, and it was hungry. The midpoint of the crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a shudder. Elian's body, pushed beyond its limits, finally gave out. A violent spasm seized him, arching his back and forcing a choked cry from his lips. His vision swam, the cool blue lights of the consoles fracturing into a million glittering shards. The last vestiges of his control shattered, and the heat, which had been a rising tide, became a tsunami. It crashed over him, wiping out thought, reason, and identity. There was no more analyst Elian. There was only a primal, desperate need, a screaming void that demanded to be filled. His body slumped forward, his head hitting the cool surface of his desk with a soft thud. He was only vaguely aware of Kyle moving, of the room's atmosphere shifting as the Alpha finally closed the distance between them. A hand, large and warm, landed on his shoulder. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure energy shot through Elian's system, 1,000 times more potent than the static charge from a faulty power conduit. He flinched away, a wounded animal's reflex, but the hand was firm, unmoving. Elian. Kyle's voice was right beside his ear now, a low, rough murmur that vibrated through his skull. The use of his first name, a stark departure from their rigid formality, was another shock to his system. Through the haze of fever, Elian smelled it. Kyle's scent. It was no longer the clean, sterile ozone he was used to. It had deepened, darkened, a rich, complex aroma of storm-charged air, hot metal, and something else, something deeply territorial and possessive. It was a scent of command, a scent that promised both danger and a strange, terrifying sort of safety. It was blanketing his own scent, overwhelming it, answering it. His body, no longer under his command, responded instinctively. He turned his head on the desk, his cheek pressing against the cool polymer, and looked up at Kyle. His vision was blurry, but he could see the raw conflict in the Alpha's eyes. The rigid control was gone, replaced by a dark, burning intensity. And behind it, something else. A flicker of his own panic mirrored in Kyle's gaze. Kyle's hand moved from his shoulder, his fingers tracing the line of Elian's jaw with a surprising, almost clinical gentleness. Then his thumb brushed against the slick, overheated skin of Elian's neck, right over the frantic pulse. The contact was devastating. Elian's breath hitched, and a soft, keening sound escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated need. It was the sound that broke Kale. With a low growl, Kale leaned in. It wasn't a kiss. It was an act of pure, instinctual claiming. He pressed his mouth to the side of Elian's neck, right over the scent gland. His lips were hot, firm. He didn't bite, not yet, but he scented him, a deep, shuddering inhalation that drew Elian's pheromones directly into his system. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic for both of them. For Elian, the direct contact, the overwhelming proximity of an alpha sent his heat into its final, critical peak. His mind went white with sensation. For Kale, the undiluted taste of Elian's essence was a data breach on a psychic level. It flooded his senses, overloading every conditioned response, every protocol, every firewall he had ever built. And then something else happened, something impossible. As Kyle's mouth pressed against his skin, a jolt, not physical, but mental, arced between them. A flash, a memory. Elian saw it, not his own memory, but Kyle's. He was a boy, no older than 7, standing in a room that was identical to Chamber 7, all white walls and sterile light. A man and a woman, his parents, stood before a calm, smiling official. The official was speaking in a low, pleasant tone, explaining that their non-compliance, their emotional volatility, made them unsuitable for raising a high designation alpha. The boy, Kale, stood perfectly still, his face a mask of taut control, as 2 orderlies led his weeping mother away. He did not cry, he did not move. He just watched, his scent turning sharp and ozonic, a child's desperate attempt to be the perfect, emotionless asset the system demanded. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Elian gasping, shuddering not just from the heat, but from the sudden, shocking influx of Kale's pain. He understood. Kale's coldness, his perfect control. It wasn't a strength. It was a scar, a shield built around the heart of a terrified little boy who had learned that emotion was a sin that would cost him everything. At the same time, Kale felt the echo of Elian's world. He felt the crushing weight of a lifetime of suppression, the constant, gnawing fear of his own biology, the shame that had been drilled into him from birth. He felt Elian's desperate loneliness, his fierce, fragile pride. He tasted it on his skin, a flavor of quiet desperation mixed with the honeyed sweetness of the heat. It was an intimacy more profound than any physical act, a violent, unsought fusion of their deepest wounds. Kale pulled back, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. He stared down at Elian, seeing him for the first time not as a rival, not as an Omega in heat, but as the other half of this terrifying, inexplicable connection. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, the rivalry that had defined them dissolved into a shared, terrifying vulnerability. The heat was no longer the primary crisis. The true crisis was this bond, this raw, empathic link that had just been forged between them in fire and desperation. They were no longer 2. They were something else. And in the cold, sterile world of the spire, that was the most dangerous thing they could possibly be. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the distant, mournful howl of the wind against the spire's kinetic barriers. The peak of the heat had broken, the overwhelming, mind-wiping intensity receding into a series of deep, shuddering aftershocks that left Elian feeling hollowed out, raw, and terrifyingly exposed. He was still slumped at his desk, his cheek pressed against the cool surface. Kyle had straightened up, putting a careful foot of distance between them, but the space felt charged, alive, humming with the ghost of their connection. Shame, hot and acidic, rose in Elian's throat. He was laid bare, his body's most private, humiliating function broadcast, and then answered. But the shame was tangled with something else, something confusing and profound. The memory, Kyle's memory. It was branded into his mind, as vivid as his own. The image of that small, stoic boy watching his family be torn apart by the very system Kyle now embodied. The coldness he had always hated in his rival was not malice. It was a survival mechanism, armor forged in trauma. Slowly, painfully, Elian pushed himself into a sitting position. He felt weak, his limbs trembling, his body aching with a deep, unfamiliar soreness. He kept his eyes downcast, unable to meet Kyle's gaze. He fumbled to pull his collar closed, a futile gesture of modesty after such a profound violation of his privacy, of his very self. He started, his voice a hoarse crackle. He didn't know what to say. There was no protocol for this, no social script. I'm sorry for my biological failure. Thank you for not... What? He didn't even know what Kyle had done or not done. The Alpha had scented him, claimed him in a primal, possessive way, but he hadn't bitten. He hadn't forced a bond. He had pulled back. Kyle remained silent. Elian could feel him watching, his gaze a heavy weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of all its earlier harshness, all its clinical detachment. It was low, strained, and deeply unsettled. Did you see? It was a question Elian was not expecting. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a report on Elian's condition. It was a question about the shared vision, a confirmation of the impossible. Elian risked a glance up. Kyle's face was pale, his usually impassive features etched with a profound, naked shock. The perfect mask was gone, and the man beneath was just as lost as Elian felt. Elian gave a small, jerky nod. Your parents, he whispered. In the white room. Kyle's jaw clenched. A muscle feathered along his cheek. He looked away, turning his head to stare at the data streams still flowing silently on his console, as if the cold logic of the numbers could somehow ground him. And I, Kyle said, his voice barely audible. I felt the suppressants, all of them, your whole life. The confession hung between them, a fragile, terrifying bridge. They had seen into each other's deepest, most guarded places. They were no longer just rivals, no longer just Alpha and Omega trapped in a room. They were accomplices in a crime that had not yet been committed, witnesses to each other's hidden truths. The rivalry, which had once seemed like the most important thing in their professional lives, now felt like a childish game. It had been a construct, a way to interact without ever having to truly see one another. Now, they had no choice but to see. Elian took a shaky breath. The air still carried the lingering scent of their combined pheromones, the sweet, fading scent of his heat and the sharp, protective ozone of Kyle's response. It was the scent of a bond, nascent and incomplete, but undeniably present. What was that? Elian asked, the question encompassing everything. The heat, the shared memory, the terrifying new connection. Kyle turned back to him, his eyes dark with an emotion Elian couldn't name. It looked like fear, but also like a grim, reluctant understanding. It is referred to in suppressed literature as a resonance cascade, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its analytical tone, a man clinging to the familiar wreckage of facts. A rare psychic phenomenon theorized to occur between certain high-designation alphas and omegas under conditions of extreme biological and emotional stress. It results in a temporary synaptic mirroring, an empathic link. He said the words as if reading from a textbook, but his eyes told a different story. They were fixed on Elian, searching for something. It is considered a myth, he added, almost to himself. A dangerous fiction. A fiction that was now their reality. The storm outside raged on, its fury a pale imitation of the tempest that had just swept through the chamber, leaving two enemies irrevocably, terrifyingly connected. The lockdown was no longer a prison for two rivals. It was an incubator for a secret that could get them both erased. The revelation of the resonance cascade settled over the chamber, heavier than the silence had ever been. It reframed everything. The heat was no longer a personal, biological failure. It was the catalyst for a systemic anomaly. And they, Elian and Kale, were now living, breathing evidence of that anomaly. They were a glitch in the spire's perfect code, a dangerous variable that, if discovered, would be ruthlessly debugged. Kale walked over to the main environmental control panel, his movements stiff and deliberate. He activated a full-spectrum atmospheric purge. A low hum filled the room as the scrubbers kicked into high-efficiency mode, pulling the pheromonally charged air through a series of catalytic converters and ionic filters. It was an attempt to erase the evidence, to return the room to its default sterile state, but they both knew it was a futile gesture. The scent was gone from the air, but it was seared into their memories, and the echo of it lingered in the ghost bond between them. Elian watched him, hugging his arms around himself. The fever had subsided, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, hollow ache in his core. But for the first time in his life, the ache wasn't just his own. He could feel a faint, phantom echo of Kyle's own turmoil. A cold, tight knot of fear and a bewildering sense of loss. He was feeling Kyle's reaction to his own stolen memory. "They will know," Elian said quietly, voicing the fear that was crystallizing between them. "My bio-monitor, the implant, it transmits everything. Heart rate, hormone levels, temperature, everything. The Central Health Authority will have a complete record of the event." Kale finished his work at the panel and turned to face him. His expression was grim, his face a mask of cold calculation once more. But Elian could now see the tension beneath it, the frantic processing of 1,000 new variables. This was no longer just Elian's problem. It was theirs. "The cyclonic event has disrupted citywide communications," Kale said, his voice clipped and precise. "Sub-etheric transmissions are down. All data from peripheral sector implants, like ours, is being locally cached, pending network restoration. The authority has a record, but they do not have it yet. A reprieve, a small, precious window of time. When the network comes back online," Elian began, but Kyle cut him off. "When the network comes back online, the cached data from your implant will show a catastrophic biological failure. You will be flagged as defective. You will be recalled for recalibration." The word was a chilling euphemism. Everyone in the spire knew what recalibration meant. It meant erasure, a complete neurological and physiological reprogramming that left behind a compliant, empty shell. Or if the defect was deemed too severe, simple decommissioning. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the heat had been, seeped into Elian's bones. He had spent his life running from this, from the spectre of being deemed flawed, and now he was staring it in the face. He looked at Kyle, expecting to see a flicker of grim satisfaction. This was, after all, the ultimate victory in their rivalry. Elian's career, his very existence, was about to be terminated due to a flaw in his fundamental nature. Kale would get the Ethelberg project, He would win. But there was no satisfaction in Kale's eyes. There was only a cold, hard focus. He was looking at Elian, but he was seeing a complex problem that needed to be solved. The cache was stored on the chamber's local server, Kyle said, already moving towards the central console. The server is shielded, but its access protocols are not infallible. Not to me. The implication was staggering. Kyle, the system's perfect son, the model analyst prime, was suggesting they tamper with official authority data. He was proposing an act of sedition. Why? Elian whispered, the question raw with disbelief. Why would you help me? This solves your problem. I'm out of your way. Kyle paused, his hand hovering over the holographic interface. For a moment, the mask of calculation slipped, and Elian saw a flicker of that 7-year-old boy in his eyes. The boy who had watched his world be destroyed by the system's cold, impartial logic. Because their recalibration is an inefficient solution, Kale said. The clinical words, a thin veil over a much deeper, more personal motive. It destroys a valuable asset for a correctable flaw. He was still speaking the language of the system, the language of assets and efficiency. But Elian heard what he wasn't saying. He heard the echo of his parents being led away. He heard the silent vow of a child who would one day become strong enough, smart enough to fight the machine that had broken him. And, Kyle added, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper, because I felt it, the shame, the fear. They programmed it into you. He looked directly at Elian, and the bond between them pulsed, a faint, shared thrum of defiance. That is a data corruption I cannot allow to persist. Suddenly, a new alert chimed from the communications panel, a single, pure tone that signified an incoming priority message. The citywide network was still down, but the Spire's internal, high-level command network had just reactivated. A text-based message began to scroll across the small screen, its letters a cold, ominous green. From Director Valerius. Subject, Unexpected Variables. Message, Analyst Prime Kyle. Analyst Elian. The cyclonic event has provided a unique opportunity to observe isolated systems under stress. Your chamber has been flagged for anomalous energy signatures. Maintain your positions. A compliance team is being dispatched to your location to assist with data verification. ETA, 90 minutes. Do not attempt to interface with the local server. Await our arrival. The message ended. They weren't just waiting for the storm to end. They were being watched, and their window of time had just shrunk to almost nothing. The director's message hung in the air, a death sentence written in calm, corporate language. Anomalous energy signatures, Elian repeated, his voice hollow. The resonance cascade. It must have put out a psychic or bioelectric pulse, something their deep-level sensors picked up. He felt a fresh wave of despair. They hadn't just been unlucky. They had tripped a silent alarm they hadn't even known existed. Valerius, Director of Special Projects. The man was a ghost in the system, a name whispered in connection with the Spire's most ruthless black box operations. He was the architect of the very conditioning programs that had shaped both their lives. If Valerius was taking a personal interest, their situation had just escalated from a problem to a catastrophe. Compliance team, Kyle said, the words like chips of ice. Not a medical team. They're not coming to help. They're coming to contain. He stared at the countdown timer that had appeared below the message. 89:47. 89:46. It was a bomb, ticking down to their erasure. For a moment, Elian's training took over. The protocol for a compromised situation was clear. Cooperate fully. Answer all questions. Trust in the authorities' judgment. To resist was to confirm guilt. His instinct was to surrender, to accept the inevitable. He had failed. This was the consequence. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling slightly. He was the defect. He was the cause of all this. But then he felt it again, the faint, phantom link to Kyle. Through it, he didn't feel Kale's fear, not in the same way he felt his own. He felt a cold, diamond-hard fury, a rage that had been suppressed and contained for decades, now focused into a single, sharp point. Kyle was not surrendering. He was preparing for a fight. They said not to interface with the server, Elian stated. The words, a test. Kale turned from the communications panel, his face a mask of predatory calm. A direct order. To disobey it is an act of treason. He walked back to the central console, his steps measured and deliberate. He held his hand over the holographic interface, the blue light bathing his skin. However, he continued, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Director Valerius is not my direct superior in the Ethelberg project. His authority here is debatable, and his message was a lie. Elian frowned. A lie. What lie? He said a compliance team was being dispatched, Kale explained, his fingers beginning to dance across the interface, calling up complex strings of code that Elian didn't recognize, implying they are in transit, but the storm has grounded all transports. No one is flying in this. They're already here. He pointed to a schematic of the spire's sublevels that he had just pulled up. A single red dot pulsed in a maintenance corridor 3 floors below them. A 2-man team. They've been stationed there since the lockdown began. This wasn't a response to an anomaly. It was a planned observation. We were the experiment all along. The revelation was chilling. The lockdown, the isolation, their proximity. It had all been by design. They had been placed in this pressure cooker deliberately to see what would happen. Valerius hadn't been alerted by a sensor. He had been waiting for a result. And he had gotten a far more spectacular one than he could have ever anticipated. They want to see the resonance cascade, Elian breathed, the pieces clicking into place. They want to capture it, to study us, to weaponize it. They were no longer just defective assets. They were a priceless, unprecedented discovery. They cannot be allowed to study it, Kyle said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. His fingers flew faster, a blur of motion. He was not just accessing the local server. He was rewriting its core permissions, building firewalls within firewalls, creating ghost directories and false data trails. He was fighting a war on a battlefield of pure information. The data from your implant is the primary evidence. We have to corrupt it, but not just delete it. Deletion would be obvious. We have to make it look like the data was corrupted by the storm's electromagnetic interference. It has to be a plausible, unavoidable accident. Elian stood up, a new resolve hardening his features. The exhaustion was still there, a deep ache in his bones, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, desperate will to survive. His fear was transmuting into anger. He had been a rat in a cage his entire life, and he was done being experimented on. The implant's data has a triple redundant quantum timestamp, Elian said, his own analytical mind kicking back into gear. You can't just alter the file. You have to corrupt the data stream at its source protocol. I can do that. Kale looked up from his work, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected Elian to panic, to freeze. He had not expected a co-conspirator. "That requires direct access to the implant's diagnostic port," Kale stated. "I can't do that remotely." "I can," Elian said. He reached up to the back of his neck, his fingers finding a small, almost invisible seam in the skin just below his hairline. It was the manual access port for the suppressant implant, a port he had never been meant to use himself. With a grimace of pain, he dug his fingernail into the seam and pulled. A small, flexible data jack, no bigger than a grain of rice, slid out on a thin, translucent filament. He walked over to Kale's side, the data jack dangling from his neck. He looked at the complex code swirling on the console, then at the timer. 78:14. 78:13. "Tell me where to connect," he said, his voice steady. For the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched Kale's lips. It was not a smile of warmth, but of respect, a smile that acknowledged a fellow warrior. The rivalry was dead. An alliance was born. The chamber transformed from a prison into a command center. The air, once thick with tension and fear, now crackled with the electric intensity of their shared purpose. They worked in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, a duet of desperate sabotage. Kyle, the architect, carved pathways through the server's code, erecting false fronts and laying digital traps for Valerius's team. Elian, the infiltrator, became the living interface, his own body the conduit for their rebellion. He sat on the floor beside Kale's chair, the filament from his implant connected to a port on the console's base. His head was leaned back against the pedestal, eyes closed as he navigated the internal software of his own body. It was a strange, invasive process. He could see his own biological data as lines of code, the spike in cortisol, the flood of oxytocin, the precise hormonal signature of his heat, all logged and time-stamped, a digital ghost of his own humiliation. He had to find the core recording function, the part of the implant's firmware that cached the data before transmission, and introduce a cascading error that would appear organic. Echo, result of external interference. Kyle spoke in a low, clipped monotone, guiding him. Isolate the primary chronometer string. It's encrypted with a recursive algorithm. You need to find the root key. "I see it," Elian murmured, his consciousness adrift in a sea of his own biology. "It's nested inside the primary hormone log." "Valerius's work," Kale grunted, his fingers never slowing. "He loves his little puzzles. He buries keys inside the data they're meant to protect." There was a grudging respect in his tone, the respect of one master strategist for another. As they worked, the bond between them, the resonance cascade, acted as a silent communication channel. Elian didn't just hear Kyle's instructions. He felt his intent, a cool, clear stream of logic that helped him focus through the pain and disorientation of interfacing with his own implant. Kyle, in turn, felt the echoes of Elian's struggle, the sting of the neural feedback, the dizzying sensation of being both operator and machine. He felt Elian's stubborn, gritty determination, and it fueled his own. They were two parts of a single mind, working in perfect synchrony. Moments of quiet intimacy punctuated the high-stakes work. At one point, a feedback loop from the implant sent a jolt of pain through Elian's skull. He cried out, his body arching in a spasm. Without a word, Kyle's hand left the console and settled on his shoulder, firm and grounding. The touch was not gentle, not comforting in a traditional sense, but it was a steady anchor. Through the bond, Kyle pushed a wave of his own calm, a feeling of cold, clear focus that helped Elian override the pain and regain control. Elian leaned into the touch for a bare second, a silent acknowledgement before turning his focus back to the code. They were a strange, beautiful, and terrifying machine, forged in the crucible of the last few hours. The timer on the comms panel ticked down, 62:37, 62:36. "The compliance team is on the move," Kale said, his eyes flicking to the schematic he still had open in a corner of the display. The red dot was ascending through the spire's maintenance shafts. "They're taking the emergency ladders, slower than a lift, but silent and untraceable. They're professionals." "I'm in," Elian breathed. "I've bypassed the root key. I have access to the caching algorithm." He could see it now, the raw data stream from the last several hours. It was a vibrant, chaotic symphony of his body's betrayal. He felt a fresh wave of shame, but it was quickly suppressed by a cold anger. This was his data, his body. Valerius would not have it. "What now?" he asked. "You can't just erase it," Kyle instructed. "You have to degrade it. Introduce white noise that mimics high-frequency electromagnetic radiation. Focus on the timestamps. Corrupt them first. If the chronology is broken, the entire dataset becomes inadmissible as evidence." It was brilliant. It wasn't just destroying the data, it was discrediting it, turning it from a smoking gun into a garbled, useless mess that could plausibly be blamed on the storm. Elian began the work, carefully weaving lines of corrupted code into the pristine record of his heat. With each altered line, he felt a sense of liberation, of reclamation. He was not erasing his experience. He was seizing ownership of it. He was taking the evidence of his flaw and turning it into a weapon. As he worked, a new memory surfaced, not from Kale this time, but from his own, long-buried past. He was a child in a health authority creche, sitting in a circle with other Omega children. A kindly instructor was explaining why their scents were dangerous, why their heats were a sickness that had to be cured by discipline and medication. She had held up a flower, a beautiful, fragrant rose. "This is lovely," she had said, her voice soft and soothing. "But its scent serves only one purpose, to attract insects for pollination. It is a primitive, messy function. We are not flowers. We are citizens. We must be clean, efficient, and pure." Then she had dipped the rose into a beaker of clear, sterile fluid. When she pulled it out, the petals were limp and translucent, the color bleached away, the scent gone. "This is control," she had said with a smile. "This is perfection." Elian's fingers faltered. The memory and the cold, deadening logic behind it filled him with a sudden, profound sadness. He had spent his entire life trying to become that bleached, scentless flower. The timer showed 47:19. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked over at Kyle, at the fierce concentration on his face. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the right to be the flower, scent and all. He was fighting for the right to be beautifully, messily, imperfectly human. The final line of corrupted code slid into place. Elian sent the command, and a wave of static washed through the data log inside his own mind. The vibrant, chaotic record of his heat dissolved into a meaningless hash of digital noise. It was done. He disconnected the filament from the console, the small jack retracting into his neck with a faint click. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the abrupt severance from the machine disorienting. He slumped against the console base, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Kyle's hand was still on his shoulder. It squeezed once, a brief, firm acknowledgement of their victory. "Report," Kyle said, his voice low. "The core log is fragmented," Elian confirmed, his voice raspy. "The timestamps are corrupted beyond recovery. Any data they pull from the implant will be useless. It will look like a hardware failure caused by a massive EM pulse from the storm." Kyle gave a single, sharp nod. He swept his own hands across the console, erasing the ghost directories, purging the command logs, wiping away every trace of their digital mutiny. In less than a minute, the server was clean, pristine, exactly as they had found it. The timer on the comms panel read 3152. The red dot on the schematic was now just one floor below them. They had done it. They had erased the primary evidence. But Elian knew it wasn't over. Valerius was not a man who relied on a single source of data. His compliance team wouldn't just be coming to download a file. They would be coming to observe, to question, to find the truth with their own eyes. And the truth was still in the room. It was in the lingering echo of the bond between them. It was in the way Cale looked at him, the new, unguarded intensity in his gaze. It was in the way Elian's body still ached with the ghost of the heat. "They'll know," Elian whispered, looking up at Cale. "They'll see it on us." Cale looked down at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply held Elian's gaze. The analytical coldness was gone, replaced by something far more complex, something that looked almost like regret. "Then we will have to lie better than we have ever lied in our lives," Kyle said softly. "The rivalry. We must put it back on. It is the only believable narrative for our interactions." He pulled his hand away from Elian's shoulder, and the absence of his touch was a physical ache. The warmth, the grounding presence, was gone. The distance between them yawned open once more. Kyle straightened up, smoothing his immaculate uniform. He walked to the center of the room, his posture once again rigid, his face settling back into the impassive mask of Analyst Prime Kyle. He was rebuilding the wall between them, brick by painful brick. "You are my competitor," Kyle stated, his voice regaining its formal, chilly tone. "You experienced a minor stress-induced physiological event due to the lockdown. I monitored your condition as per standard safety protocols. Nothing more. It was the official story, the lie they would live or die by." Elian understood the necessity of it, but a sharp, unexpected pang of loss shot through him. He had, for a few short hours, seen the man behind the mask. He had felt a connection, a partnership. Now he was being asked to pretend it had never happened, to go back to being enemies. He pushed himself to his feet, his own body protesting. He walked back to his station, the distance across the room feeling like miles. He sat down, straightened his own tunic, and called up the Ethelberg data on his screen, forcing his eyes to focus on the numbers. He was Analyst Elian again, controlled, composed, flawless. But it was a lie. Everything was a lie. The timer ticked below 10 minutes, 09:59, 09:58. A new tension settled in the room, colder and sharper than before. It was the tension of performance, of two actors waiting for their cue. They did not speak. They did not look at each other. They simply worked, or pretended to. The silence between them, a carefully constructed facade of professional animosity. Elian could still feel the bond, a faint, thrumming wire stretched taut between them. Through it, he could feel Cale's focus, a laser-like concentration on the role he was about to play. And beneath that, a deep, resonant anger, directed not at Elian, but at the door, at the men who were about to walk through it. A low chime echoed through the chamber. The lockdown was ending. The door, a seamless panel of white polymer, hissed open. Two men stood in the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the stark white light of the corridor. They wore the grey, featureless uniforms of the Compliance Division, their faces obscured by reflective visors that turned them into anonymous, insect-like figures. Behind them, standing with an air of serene, unassailable authority, was Director Valerius. He was older than Elian had expected, with silver hair and a face that was disarmingly kind, etched with the gentle wrinkles of a grandfather. He was not wearing a uniform, but a simple, well-tailored civilian tunic. He smiled, a warm, paternal expression that did not reach his cold, pale eyes. "Gentlemen," Valerius said, his voice as pleasant and chilling as Elian had imagined. "Forgive the intrusion. I trust the storm has not been too disruptive." The final act had begun. Valerius entered the chamber alone, leaving his two compliance officers standing like sentinels at the door. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace, his eyes taking in every detail of the room. The pristine consoles, the scrubbed air, the two analysts standing stiffly at their stations. His gaze was like a physical touch, inquisitive and unnervingly perceptive. He stopped in the center of the room, exactly where the air had been thickest with the scent of Elian's heat just an hour before. He took a slow, deliberate breath, a connoisseur sampling a rare vintage. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He could feel Kyle's own coiled tension through their bond, a predator's stillness before a strike. "A remarkable storm," Valerius commented, his eyes twinkling, as he looked from Kale to Elian and back again. "These cyclonic events create the most fascinating atmospheric distortions, pockets of intense electromagnetic flux. They can play havoc with sensitive electronics." He was offering them the lie, testing to see if they would take the bait. "We experienced several power fluctuations, Director," Kyle replied, his voice a perfect facsimile of his usual cold formality. "But all critical systems, including the server cache, remained shielded and stable." It was a bold move. Kyle wasn't just accepting the lie. He was reinforcing it, preemptively denying the very excuse they had manufactured. He was daring Valerius to challenge him. Valerius's smile widened slightly. He turned his attention to Elian. "Analyst Elian, my records indicate a period of physiological distress. Your implant flagged a significant deviation from your baseline." His gaze was sharp, probing. He was looking for a crack in the facade. Alien's training, his entire life's conditioning, screamed at him to confess, to defer to authority. But the memory of the bleached flower, the echo of Kale's stolen childhood, the raw, defiant anger that had been forged in the last few hours, it held him steady. He met the director's gaze, forcing his own expression to remain neutral, even slightly annoyed. "A stress-induced migraine, Director," Elian said, his voice cool, brought on by the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "It is a documented medical sensitivity." The episode was brief. "Analyst Prime Kale monitored my condition as per protocol. I have since recovered." He was proud of his delivery. The tone was right. The lie was plausible. But then Valerius took a step closer to him, his kind eyes filled with a look of paternal concern. "A migraine? How unpleasant. May I?" Before Elian could react, Valerius reached out and gently placed the back of his hand against Elian's forehead. The touch was dry and cool, but it sent a jolt of pure terror through him. It was a test, a bluff. Valerius was searching for the lingering fever, the residual heat. But the worst of it had passed, leaving only a deep, internal ache. "Your temperature seems normal now," Valerius said, withdrawing his hand. "I'm relieved." He was toying with them. He knew. On some level, he had to know. The lack of a complete data log from the implant would be the ultimate proof that something had been hidden. He was just enjoying the game, watching them squirm. "The Ethelberg anomaly," Valerius said, changing the subject with a breezy confidence. "Your rivalry on this project has become legendary, gentlemen. Two of my finest minds, constantly pushing each other to new heights of excellence. It is the very model of productive competition that the Spire encourages." He paced slowly towards the panoramic window, looking out at the now subsiding storm. But competition, like any powerful tool, has its limits. Sometimes the most profound breakthroughs come not from conflict, but from synthesis, from the merging of two seemingly opposing forces into a new, more powerful whole. He turned back to face them, his smile gone, his eyes cold and hard as chips of ice. "Your chamber was flagged for a bio-empathetic resonance event, a resonance cascade, as the old texts call it, a perfect, unprecedented synthesis. And yet, I find the two of you standing on opposite sides of the room, the air cold with a manufactured rivalry. The data from your implant, analyst Elian, is conveniently corrupted, and you both lie to my face with such admirable composure." He knew. He had known all along. The game was over. The trap was sprung. "You have no proof, Director," Kale said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You have a sensor glitch and a corrupted data file. That is all." Valerius chuckled, a soft, dry sound. "Proof? My dear analyst, I don't operate on proof. I operate on results. And you too. You are the most fascinating result I have seen in my entire career." He took another step towards them, his eyes alight with a terrifying scientific curiosity. "I don't want to punish you. I want to understand you. This bond, it could be the key to the next stage of human evolution. A controlled, telepathic link between an alpha and an omega. The applications are limitless: military, espionage, social control." He was laying his cards on the table. He didn't want to erase them. He wanted to vivisect them, mentally and emotionally. He wanted to own their connection. "You will be transferred to my division," Valerius stated, his voice hardening into a command. "You will cooperate with my research. You will help me replicate this phenomenon. This is not a request." Elian felt a cold knot of despair tighten in his stomach. This was a fate worse than recalibration. To have the one pure, real thing that had ever happened to him turned into a tool for the very system he despised. He looked at Kale, a silent, desperate plea. Kale's face was unreadable, but through the bond, Elian felt a surge of something so cold and violent it took his breath away. It was the fury of a caged animal that had just been told its cage was about to get much, much smaller. Kale took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elian. A subtle, protective gesture. "Director," Kale said, his voice dropping to a near subsonic growl. "You are mistaken. There was no resonance event. There is no bond." He raised his hand, and the holographic interface of the main console flared to life at his command. "There is, however, a flaw in the Ethelberg data you provided us, a flaw I believe you inserted deliberately. The tables had just been turned."